Okay, welcome everybody and good evening. My name is Sarah Schneiderman and I'm a faculty member here at UBC in the Department of Anthropology, as well as the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. And I'm one of the members of the UBC Himalaya Program Steering Committee. And on behalf of our program, I'd like to welcome you to UBC this evening. We're very excited to be able to host this event in person. It's been a long time since we could do this regularly, and it feels especially gratifying to be able to gather together to honor the author of this wonderful new work and to discuss the issues that bring us all together here. Before going further, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered here this evening on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people, and to recognize the privilege which we have to gather here on this land where they have been for generations. And I was just thinking about how fitting it is to reflect upon that as we're here to discuss a book titled We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies, which also signifies a strong connection to land, territory, and place, even if in a very different part of the world. The Himalaya program here at UBC draws upon faculty expertise, student engagement, and community partnerships to create an interdisciplinary hub for sharing knowledge about the Himalayan region, including Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Tibetan cultural zones that traverse this entire region. And we have been gathering here together since 2015 to bring our shared interests into conversation. And we host a series of events which were largely online over the past couple of years, but now we're returning to in person, we hope. And we also host a series of intensive community engaged language learning opportunities in both the Tibetan and Nepali languages, which are ongoing right now. Can I have the next? Thank you. And so we just wanted to thank our steering committee for their support. I work together with Catherine Hacker, Elsie Lewison, Dagmar Sperk, Tsering Shakya, Pasang Yanji Sherpa, Ratna Shrestha, Mark Turin, and Belinda Suan, our program assistant here, to make all of this happen. And I would just like to thank everybody who's put all of their hard work and effort into making this possible. I'd also like to thank the Department of Asian Studies and the Institute of Asian Research here at UBC for supporting our effort. Slide, please. As I mentioned, we currently have two intensive language courses going on right now. Sonam Chisang, who is the Tibetan instructor, is here this evening. Thank you for all of your hard work. And we have about 16 or 17 students in each class. Some of you are here this evening learning Nepali and learning Tibetan. And these are unique opportunities in Canada, which we're very pleased to be able to continue offering here. And yes, just a couple of images of the classes that have been ongoing this week. And so we're also especially pleased to have this event in conjunction with the classes. It's a special event. That's all I'd like to say. Before going further, I just want to display our website here. If you're not on our mailing list already and you would like to hear more about future events and language learning opportunities, please do sign up and then you'll receive future updates. So I would now like to introduce my colleague, Professor Tsering Shakya, who will be introducing our speakers and moderating the event this evening. Thank you, and a big welcome also to everybody who is watching us online. Just for those in the room, please do note that we are live streaming the event. Just be aware of that. Oh, and sorry, a few housekeeping issues that I forgot to mention. First of all, we do have tea and momos, dumplings available after the event. So please join us in the lounge outside for a reception and further conversation then. And also, if you would like to purchase the book, which we're hearing about this evening, we have a representative from the UBC bookstore here this evening in the back of the room, and you can purchase the book from her there. Thank you very much. Over to you, Tsering.
Thank you very much, Sarah. First, I'd like to say that this today's program is organized jointly between UBC Himalaya Program and the Tibetan Cultural Society of British Columbia. And I would like to invite Chu Yudola, who's the president of the Tibetan Cultural Society of British Columbia, to come up there and say a few words about community and to speak about the Buddhist Tibetan. Thank you.
First of all, Sangmal Teshle, I'd like to send a great warm greetings first. And since this is very, very uncomfortable to me to speaking like this, which is looks like a lecture or something. I used to be a monk, is more Zen, but this here is more like all seriousness. So anyway, jokes apart. Since I have a contacted with Tsering Shakya regarding the Himalayan program, a few emails and each other. So finally, I'm here with a discussion with my executive members, so-called. So first of all, the Himalayan steering committee, thanking for this kind of event, especially like Tibetan who is study here and launching a book, which is so proud as an individual Tibetan. So before I go too much, because there's not much time, about Tibetan community in British Columbia is, I won't go too much detail of it because you might know, or you can look into our website, TCS or BC, Tibetan Cultural Society of BC. And basically, the Tibetans are resettled here since early 70s, I guess. So till now, if I'm updating you, there's about over 500 Tibetans living in here. I can assure you that. But honestly speaking, when there is a Tibetan community gathering, there's you can see head counted is just over 200. Just to let you know how even the over 200 Tibetan who are very involved with this small community is quite rich and very encouraging. People like me, I've been a 2 years term, 1 year is the pandemic, which have nothing to do. But other than that, it's a regular annual Tibetan community event to promote Tibetan culture and awareness of other issues about Tibet. And so this is what Tibetans here living, what we do normal Tibetan New Year's and stuff. Also, but the important thing is we have an annual Tibet festival, which is the most important day that we celebrate as a Tibetan to more like promote. Oh, there you go. Sorry about that. This is a very unprofessional. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I came from very, very far. What do you call? Just 1 second, please. Yeah. So yeah, 1 year now after pandemic, we got a few things to do. The Tibet Festival is we are planning to, which is the most important thing for non-Tibetan to understanding basic Tibetan culture and interaction and whatever the future plans. And so that is the most important day that might you guys might need interested to join or to in future. It's usually it's in the middle of August. So I'm still thinking of looking for venues, but all are unfortunately sold out right now because of the pandemic. Everything's booking about 1 year ahead. So that's the main thing that I like to share. That in the near future to learn more about it, about the Tibetan community, whatever, our members, how many in there that you can learn from, you can interact each other. So that's all I can say. Finally, as a Tsering Yangzom, but what I noticed just when I'm driving, I'm speaking with Tsering La, and I know the name is Tibetan, but when I saw it's Yangzom's daughter, and we came from same village, Tibetan refugee settlement in Nepal. And when even the later husband, when he first came to as an employee, officer in our settlement, we know very well, very know each other. They're very dear to us, especially her and her family and my wife's family and my family is very connected. Now here, we met here, but especially Sonam knows very well. I know very well the face and she's early, I think, in Canada, but we met in Toronto. I spoke with her. She even argued Jonor or something, my brother. So anyways, these are really childhood memory. They grew up in a Tibetan settlement. So her mother is very humble, and her father was very smart, intelligent guy that I know of. I have very good memories about him serving. So it is coincide that I'm a Tibetan who grew up in Tibetan refugee camp, Pokhara, same villages as that. It's so coincident, and because I'm a so-called president right now, to introduce her is really proud, and it's very emotional, and I'm really proud. I will say this to our Tibetan settlement, which is really a big round of applause from my community and our settlement to let them know. I'm really grateful, and thanks for letting me come here and speak a few words. That's all I can do. And yes, and I have as a gesture of offering kata to her, which is this is the best gift or offering, which is a very special. I'm very special today to be here. Good chair.
Thank you, Richula. As soon as we Tibetans start to see each other, talk to each other, we always know somebody. We have always connection. We are only sort of one person distance. And when I said I was organizing Singla's event, then the other Tibetans, Benden, said, "Who's she?" And I said, "Come, you will know her." I told her. And as Benden walked in, he said, "I know your father." So this is a connection we are actually such a small community, and whenever we talk, we always know each other, or we know the sisters or your cousins or your brother, and we all come from similar sort of background. So it's always very heartwarming that to do this. And I'm really very pleased to introduce our speakers and the author of the book that's being launched. Tsering Yangzom Lama when I first joined UBC, one of the first people I met was Tsering Yangzom Lama because she was a student, and 3 Tibetan students were at the time, and Tsering Lama. And all of the 3 Tibetan students have become very successful, and other is a Butila, who's now sort of rising star in Canadian politics in Ontario. So Tsering Lama was born in Nepal and has lives in Vancouver. She did undergraduate at UBC, and she did her MFA in writing from Columbia University. And she's a recipient of numerous awards for her writing. Those of us who follow sort of literary journals from Nepal will be familiar with her publications and short stories, which are published in Himal, South Asia, and Lalit. And one of her short stories was published in the anthology of the great writings from Nepal, and also collections in Old Demon, New Deities, short stories by Tibetan writers. And her debut novel, you will see, is on sale. Please do purchase it. I've read it. I got a review copy. I read that Mark so many, and I'm going to quiz her now on all these points. And her debut novel, We Measure the Earth with Our Body, has been described as a haunting first novel that recounts a Tibetan family's 50-year journey through exile and their struggle to forge new life of dignity, love, and hope, and named one of by the publisher Weekly as writers to watch for then, and also it described as the most anticipated book of the year by Publishers Weekly. And I'm also very fortunate and really delighted to see for discussing, we have a Billy-Ray Belcourt, to discuss the book with Tsering La, who is a writer, academic from Nepal Cree Nation. He's also a professor at UBC Create Writing Program, and he's also winner of numerous awards, 2018 PL Tutor Foundation Scholar. He earned PhD in English from University of Alberta. He's also Rhodes Scholar in 2016 at Oxford at Wharton College. His notable publications are the books This Wound is the World, DN coping mechanism, Notes from the Field, History of My Brief Body. His writing touches on understanding how indigenous people shoulder sadness, pain like theirs without giving up on the future. And this is really much of the theme that is captured in Tsering La's work. So what we'll do is I'll ask Tsering La to speak some about her work and read some parts extract from her book, and then I'll ask questions from sort of Tibetan perspective, and Bill will ask in terms of literary and things that universal questions about survival, sadness, and things, migration, things that the book explores. And I also want to sort of connect the book to UBC later.
Is it working? Yeah. Is it working? Hello? Hello? Okay. All right. Nga tashtu shugi dal papa mambole dunga pe kauchung. Ni tuji che. I want to thank Kayla for organizing all of this. Kayla actually reached out to me 2 years ago when the first announcement of the book being sold came out. And right away he said, we have to organize something here. And you know, he was very, very encouraging, actually has been for many years for me to do this work. So thank you so much. And obviously Kayla's work is really, really important in Tibetan history and scholarship. And he also was a teacher of mine in Tibetan literature many years ago. What is it, 15 years ago, perhaps. So it feels really like a full circle moment for me to be here with my teacher. And I also want to thank Billy-Ray, who's a writer that I've deeply admired for about 4 years when I first came across his work. And there are many, many resonances that I find between his work and mine. You know, I'm quite inspired by his, the beauty of his prose and the strength of his intellect. And when I read his work, I find it very generative. It gives me a lot to work with. So it's a real honor to have you here. Thank you. Oh, I should take my book. I'll say that this book, it began out of a desire to just simply tell a good story. You know, about really, I was thinking a lot about the camp that my parents lived in, and I wanted to write about this experience that had happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And it's really an experience of the immediate shock of being expelled from your country and having to start over with nothing. And how did they survive? And how did they persist in such a difficult circumstance? There was very little from that time that I could look at, that I could see. A lot of that history was lost, I think, because the focus was survival. And so I decided that I would try to imagine that history. And that's what this project began with. But as I started to work, I realized that there was so much in Tibetan culture and history that I didn't know and I wanted to learn more about. Particular traditions like the Tibetan oracular tradition of having oracles, lamos. That was something that, I guess Tibetans, we know that people do premonitions and healings, but I didn't understand how deep that went into our culture. Thousands of years of Tibetan women, especially too, like in villages in Western Tibet, Central Tibet, being the main healer or source of guidance for a village. That was really beautiful, this idea that women had been leaders in this way for thousands of years. I found that to be very moving. So that became this inspiration for this book. Like, can I tell this story with a woman at the center? Can I tell this story with this kind of a woman at the center? And I wanted to change, the narrative of Tibetans leaving Tibet is often told through one lens, right? Through our leader, through His Holiness, and through the Nechung Oracle, who led His Holiness into exile and said the path. But I was like, okay, maybe there's a way to make a woman at the center and a female oracle. And in fact, the whole story can be mostly about women. And so that's what I set out to do. And in that process, I feel like I learned a lot about things that I had been denied because of history, because of exile. And I like to think that this was a way for me to build a bridge back as well. And that's what became a very rich experience for me. I think I'll stop there and we can have a discussion after. So maybe I'll just read a few pages. I'll read from the beginning of the book. So the book begins in spring 1960. And this is on the border of Western Tibet and Nepal, from the perspective of a young girl named Hamo. Amma was an oracle. The realization came to my mother late in life, when her monthly bleeding stopped and something else opened inside. Some in our village called it an affliction. They said there was a crack in her mind that left her open to spirits who would consume her. But Amma insisted that it was a blessing to lend her body to the gods and allow them to speak through her. In time, everyone would listen, and the words of an otherwise ordinary woman would lead us through the coming troubles. It wasn't just my mother who had changed. Packs of wolves and rats swept through our valley. Next, there was an earthquake that tore a jagged line through our village monastery. Then, just as I was learning to speak, there came news that invaders had crossed our border, entering our land as two enormous snakes. In the distant town of Kadze, people watched them cross the river in long lines and burrow into the highlands. They wished to be called the People's Liberation Army, but we knew them as the Gyami, a people from the lowlands to the east. In the years that followed, rumors came like crows, even traveling as far west as our village. Although I was just a young girl, many of the rumors landed in my ears before anyone else in my family. My source was Laksam, my oldest friend. He worked as a servant to a traveling merchant who traded in gossip as much as iron pots and pans. In our free moments, Laksam and I wandered in the pastures with my little sister, Tenki, hanging on my back or flopping around in the grass. In those hills, Laksam told me the most shocking stories. Gyami soldiers had seized farmland in the east, and many of our people were now starving. No grain, no salt, no meat, or even butter. I walked around in a daze after hearing this, unable to imagine life without butter. Laksam said that although it was quiet in our region, a resistance raged in the east, in places where iron birds circled the skies, and bullets, big and small, rained down on entire towns, smashing bodies as if they were nothing but effigies made of dough. Where rooftops were torn apart, and no one could tell whether they had found the remains of a loved one or that of a stranger. But I did not tell my family these things. I never repeated them to anyone. Then, last spring, our village heard of a terrifying ruse. a plan to lead the precious one into the dragon's home. Hearing about this trap, thousands of our people in Lhasa gathered around the summer palace, forming a protective circle with their bodies. Even as the soldiers neared and the scent of gunpowder swirled in the air, our people refused to leave. To prevent a massacre, the precious one disguised himself as a commoner and fled south by night to another country. So did the great Nechung oracle, who had divined their escape route through the mountains. When the foreign troops learned that our leader had slipped away, they pierced the crowd with bullets and lined the street with corpses. After the precious one left, the sun was erased from our skies. Flowers refused to bloom, and our yaks made no milk. In that darkness, every family in our village wondered if it was time to leave, to follow our leader to the lowlands until the day when it would be safe to return. Others recited a bleak and ancient prophecy. When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, the people of snows will be scattered like ants across the face of the earth. It was that day, nearly 10 years after revealing that the gods had spoken to her, when Amma said to us, "Now is the time. I must give my body to the spirits." Sitting in the kitchen floor beside my sister, I watched my father's face in the hearth's glow. Bala remained still as we chewed on strips of dried meat that Amma had cured over the winter. I could see that our father was clearly picturing everything that would change for us. But after a long while, he frowned, showing all of his new wrinkles at once, and nodded in agreement. By morning, our entire village had heard that Amma would begin the rites for instructing the gods. She would finally call them down to her. Okay. So then I think I'm going to read just the beginning of the next section, which is from present day. And this is the perspective of Doma, who is Tamo's daughter. And this is in 2012 in Toronto, Canada. The street lamp emits a sickly yellow glow that filters into our basement window the same way it does every night. It's just enough light for me to find a clean shirt without waking my aunt in the next room. She's asleep at the kitchen table, her head bobbing above a dinner plate, her mouth slightly open. She must have returned from another double shift while I was napping. In the shadows, Shumotenki's face is all ridges and slopes, and she's so still and thin. I owe her everything, yet I cannot bear the sight of her frailty, the weariness she wears so nakedly across her face. My aunt brought me here, or I should say pulled me here, for that would be the closest approximation of our word. With my first plane ticket and my first passport. "Don't be too clever when they check your papers," she instructed over the phone before I left for Tribhuvan Airport. "Say nothing unless they ask you." Throughout my 2-day journey, I pictured a disastrous arrival at Toronto. I imagined being turned away after landing. It had happened to a cousin of a friend, and shuffled into a holding cell where I'd wait until I could be returned to Nepal. Even after the border agent stamped my passport and I picked up my suitcase, I expected someone to turn me back. It was only once I was in the apartment that I unclenched my teeth and let my eyes relax and lose focus. Then a new unhappiness set in, a new understanding that I'm still circling after 5 years in this country. My aunt was in pain and so very alone. Her state had been unknown to our family and neglected for years. Sometimes she cries and cries and cannot tell me why. Sometimes she stops on the sidewalk and laughs so loudly everyone in the street turns to look. Most of her struggles, her strange behaviors, remain private between the two of us. A stove left burning, days where she only drinks water, or when she turns off all the lamps and keeps the curtains drawn because light makes her head pound, her joints ache. She tells me that even her eyes fail her on some days. Was this country the cause? I often wonder this in the early days as I roamed my new neighborhood, along streets named King and Queen, though they were lined with low-income high-rises full of black-haired foreigners like ourselves. Would my aunt be cured if I could make us wealthy, comfortable, or if we became true Canadians with those embossed Navy passports? But it soon dawned on me that paper alone would not be enough to make us belong. We wore our difference on our bodies, not just in our dark hair and brown skin, but in our posture. The slower foreign rhythms of our steps. Amid the squat brick storefronts of Parkdale, Shumotenki and I walked with our necks pressed down by some invisible force, our line of sight hemmed in by the endless web of streetcar cables above us. Along the side streets, we found our forgotten neighbors from Nepal. They now lived in houses cut into apartments, which were once halfway houses, and before that, the summer homes of the wealthy. Nearby, just past Gardiner Expressway, the gray expanse of Lake Ontario sent a winter draft we could not shake. And everywhere in the air, there was a distinct feeling that our corner of the city was not the Western world, not the one we imagined or the one we could even describe to our relatives back in the camp. Some triumphantly called this place Little Tibet, but to me, this place is the camp built anew, a copy of home, another temporary stop in an endless journey.
Thank you, Tsering. I was fortunate to get the review copy from the publisher and read the book. As you can see, I made a lot of marks in there. It's each time it sort of places are marked is the places that I sort of like thought it was about me or my family. I can say, yes, and because I also grew up in Kathmandu and Nepal, and we've been all gone through the same places. Then another time I felt like how much UBC is connected with the story. In the story, there are it's about the Tibetan settlement in Pokhara, but then there's volunteers who had gone there, Westerners who were working there, teachers working there. And another theme in the book, which I think I felt a lot mentioned, there was sort of quite sadness, but some also mentions of death. Death appears quite a lot in the book. There's a lot of death in the book. And that actually reminds me of some archive materials that are in UBC. And a few years ago, I was going through the UBC library and the archives that belongs to George Woodcock. And there was a letter, and because it's to do the death, I'm just going to write a letter written by Judy Pollan, who you all know as a Judy Lab, who was a Canadian University Service Overseas. It's those Americans who don't know, this is a Canadian equivalent of Peace Corps, who went to volunteer in the Tibetan settlement. And this Canadian volunteers were organized by two UBC professors. And the letters the UBC students were writing to the UBC professor. And one of the letter, Judy writes to Dear Professor Woodcock, your letter on December 3rd was just handed to me by our barefoot postman from the neighboring jungle village. Since my last letter, about 4 or 5 more people have died. I haven't the latest figures. One mother leaves 3 children orphaned, a girl at Kalimpong, a small girl and teenage son at Madras. Day after mother died, I got a letter from the son saying he wants to come here for Christmas holiday. And I couldn't, please could I send the money for the train ticket? Boy doesn't know yet. I wrote to the principal, asked him to break the news. Another letter Judy writes to Dear Professor Woodcock, in January 1st this year, 13% of our children here at Mongood have died. What this figure means in terms of human suffering and misery for the families who have already suffered so many losses can scarcely be imagined. On January 1st, there were 574 children here of age 10 and under. Of these, 44 died between January 1st and April. He goes on and she makes a table of lists of deaths that are happening. And these are sort of UBC students who are volunteering in the camp. And this way. But we know, despite this kind of deaths and invention, but it's also very hopeful. We know today these settlements are flourishing, incredibly flourishing, and they are so successful in that way. And another aspect that is where the second generations from these camps have now migrating to the West, to Toronto, to New York, to Vancouver. As you mentioned, some community from the same Pokra settlements are here in this room, and with the book deals with, tells the story of. So I just want to ask you, in terms of book, this is a story of a family, but it's also history of the Tibetan community. Or were you writing a historical? Because we don't. It's our story. Yeah. It's a historical story of the present.
Yes, I have this. So for me, I wanted to tell the story of this historical moment, beginning with the moment a nation is lost until as close to present day as I could get. So it really ends in 2012, which is around the time of a lot of self-immolations in Tibet, which I think is also another theme of the book, which is bodies and how bodies are, how bodies are used and how bodies travel and how bodies experience all kinds of things. And so, for me, I wanted to tell this whole story, this huge expanse of time, basically modern Tibetan history, but I wanted to tell it through individual people, through a family that is very fractured and spread all over the world. I think somebody in one of the reviews called it a domestic epic, which I think is a funny term, but I'll take it. It has historical concerns, but it is focused on individuals. And I think for me, the Tibetan narrative has not focused enough on individuals, especially ordinary individuals, just people who aren't leaders, people who aren't elite, people who aren't like in centers of power. And so that's why I wanted to just really get down to ordinary women in camps and their lives and lift their lives to the level of historical significance, I guess.
And you do that really well. It's the voices of the ordinary people in there and the experience. And the other aspect is it's about movement, journey. People are always constantly moving, and no one is settled. And even the book ends with the question of where you belong. Are you always going to be in the margin? So in terms of this moment, I think as a Tibetan and as a refugee or migrants, we had constant move and a sense of belonging. Do you think it's a sort of the issue is about your own sort of sense of belonging? Are you a Canadian? Are you sort of a Nepali? Are you, where is your home?
I think for a lot of Tibetans in exile, there is this long sort of dream or promise of home, and a lot of us, some of this is like quite abstract for people who've actually never stepped foot in Tibet, and I think there's a lot of ambivalence maybe about where home is. To be able to say that, or where you belong, is like a very, very difficult thing, and perhaps you have to be quite privileged to be able to say, this is my home. I think in this day and time, tens of millions of people don't have that feeling, right? That are displaced people. Things like 70 million displaced people alive in the world right now. So that very question and that inability to answer that question is the point of the book for me, to show how much people exist in an in-between state, facing both directions at once, unable to move one way or another, but finding a way to, stay connected to this idea of home is just as important. It's a really, I think the meatiness and the difficulty of answering that question is the point for me.
Because in the book, one of the main protagonists in the book, only returns home as ashes. Mm-hmm. So is it, so do you think is that sort of our own sort of hopefulness of reborn in our own homeland? Or you travel back there. What is that sort of the metaphor of only the ashes returning? You know, does it give a hope, or is it sort of a hopeless situation that you're?
Yeah, well, to me, exile is a paradoxical thing. It's full of paradox. You're always moving, but you're never really moving. You know, you're moving forward while looking backward, I guess. And so that scene in the book where the character is only able to return as ashes, really, she's rejoins the earth in a sense, and that story is about the sense that there is no separation between that earth and the body. And this is a kind of a homecoming that all of us can, I guess, look forward to. Yeah.
I think Tibetans, you know, we always have some degree of, even when I tell Tibetan, why aren't you studying it? Said so much, you know, there's a next life, I'll do it, you know. Always, and so I think, my God, you know, some days it's quite hopeful. Sort of people we are, you know, even if you don't succeed this year, I'll do it next year.
Yeah.
You know, we said so much. You know, they say that, you know, and I used to think it's a joke, but until some realize it's quite seriousness. People really think there's next life that I'm going to do my PhD, not this life. But I always tell them, but your supervisor might not come back that way. It really, and you deal quite a lot of also themes about poverty, hardship. You know, what people have to do to survive in that. You know. And you compare sort of migration to the West, and one of the characters says in the West that you have to reach to see the skies. You know, that's another aspect of that. The difference is that we experience. And recent flood in New York, you know, when the basements flooded, you know, almost all our communities, many of our communities who migrated to New York were living in these basements, and some of the people died, and we know from that basement flood. And that's also constant sort of uncertainty, precarious, you know, sort of life of the migrant community is also doing that. But another level, like you, me, sort of a success story. So in a way, we somehow do manage and do survive, and you know, have some status, and some we have a new way of negotiating that.
Right. But I think that's really, you know, somebody pointed this out to me afterwards. That like Tenki, it's my husband actually who pointed this out to me. But Tenki and Dolma, Tenki is the aunt, Dolma is the young girl that I just read from. They both are very, very brilliant, and they both have incredible promise. So Tenki is in the camp, and everybody thinks she's the smart one in the camp. She's going to do something. She's going to be someone. But you know, the challenges that she faces are so great, and this really has to do with her privilege, her class, and all of these things that she cannot overcome them, even though her mind is, you know, incredible. And Dolma has just a little bit more privilege because of the sacrifices her mother and her grandparents and everybody made. So she's able to get a little bit closer to that ideal of success. But Dolma's story is one of questioning what that success even means, and what game she is even going to play. You know, whether she will accept the Canadian or the Western notion of success, whether she wants to belong to that worldview, or whether she has to find something else. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that this idea of, you know, hard work leading to success is obviously a lie. Everybody knows this, right? Meritocracy is a very, very bad myth, a very, very damaging myth. And I think, you know, in the US, it has done a lot more damage, where we have a lack of empathy for, I lived in the US for the last 10 years. We have a lack of empathy for people who are struggling because we say, oh, they haven't worked hard enough. But I hope in my book that I'm trying to show that, history has a much greater force in your fate than just your abilities or your dedication or your hard work.
One other thing, just my last sort of question to you, is one of the themes that you did is about, you know, the contemporary issues about survival and what people do to survive. And one of the way people survive is selling statues and things which are really sacred to us, but we do. But and you done really well by, but you don't sort of say blame it to this bad Nepali or Westerners who are coming and hoodwink this sacred art. You do it in a similar way. The people are surviving. You know, they have to sell their goose, the statues and the sacred things in sort of way of sort of survival. You know, and that I think was quite my experience. That a lot of Tibetan families had to do that to survive, although it was so important. So in a way, it's sort of you don't blame, but you give agency to the community of a way to survive that way.
Right. Yeah, I think, if we get just down to the micro level of individual actions, then we might start to blame people for whatever actions they take. But if we scan out a little bit and look at what's actually happened is colonization, dispossession, exile, poverty, statelessness. Okay, then who's really helping Tibetan people? Not many, right? So people have to survive one way or another. And I'm interested in people that are on the margins, people who are outcasts, people that are misfits. I think they're the most interesting people to write about. And so having a Tibetan person who sells goose, who sells these precious objects in order to survive, felt like a really interesting, rich space to write about and not to judge, but actually to say, why would this happen? And certainly there have been many British people who have stolen Tibetan treasures and Chinese and so forth, but Tibetans are also part of this, and this is not about judgment, but in fact, that's like the least important thing for me.
Thank you. And now I'm going to ask Billy-Ray to sort of give some of his thought, because we want to invite someone who's reading outside Tibetan community, what they felt about reading, hearing the voices of Tibetan characters, and some ways moving to Canada, I really learned a lot before. When in England, sort of colonial sort of mind, I never thought about indigenous community, the native community at all. British sort of being brought up in British education system, you forget about that. They never done. But when I first came to Canada and people start think land acknowledgement, it's completely startled me and me to rethink about other communities of colonized community in that way. So now I have a completely different perspective in where I look at Tibet and other communities and how I sort of empathize and resonate. Everyday struggle resonates with me. And I'm just wondering how Billy thought about the story of this Tibetan sort of diaspora sense loss of belonging.
Well, firstly, it's really an honor to be here and to be amidst your readers and your community. I'm from the Drop Cree Nation in Northwest Alberta, Treaty 8 territory, and I'm a prof here in the School of Creative Writing. I teach both poetry and Indigenous writing. I'll just begin with a couple remarks about the novel. Firstly, at the level of craft and at the level of the sentence, I kept thinking like how impossibly perfect it was. Like not a single word or sentence seems to be out of place or misplaced. And also, and we can talk about this too, but and that you allude to it, there's sort of this kind of sense of global consciousness that I felt, that I think because there's this sort of shared struggle for life and land against colonial forces, both here in Canada, sort of my people, Indigenous nations across the country, and then also sort of in Tibet, that some kind of sense of global solidarity is possible that I think has not been quite fully articulated or actualized, precisely for the purpose, in the interest of colonial powers. And I think of, one of, our great storytellers, Lee Miracle, who passed away last year, who's from her people are, from these territories here. And she had been doing work in a sort of global frame to do precisely that work of sort of widening the anti-colonial mindset. And so I think that sort of, and I'm sure that work is possible in this context too. But I sort of have a number of questions I want to ask you, and I prepared some. But firstly, we first met in January 2018 at the Banff Center for the Arts. We didn't really get to talk though. I'm assuming you were working on this novel while you were there.
Yeah.
Where in that stage were you?
At that stage, I didn't have an agent. I didn't have a book deal. I was just editing.
Mm-hmm.
The book was done, but I was still editing.
Right. It's sort of amazing to think of, there was this book there, now it's here, but yeah, I just thought that was a fun thing to think about. So firstly, I read in an interview that you did with Electric Literature that at one point you returned, or you trekked to the border of Nepal and Tibet. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that journey and whether or not it shaped the writing or compelled you to rethink any parts of the project.
Yeah, so I went to the border of Tibet and Nepal over 10 years ago, which actually I had started the novel at that point, if you can believe it. It's taken me a while to finish this. But I trekked to the border. Really, this was mostly for me to experience the landscape that a lot of people experienced in reverse when they left. So Mustang and that region is really where, people escape from. And you can really feel the plateau ending and you go down. And I remember I trekked there, and then I was at the final city, Lomantang, which is the walled city. It's an ancient city, and the city is like a fort. It's like 700 years old. It's still the same. And there's a king there, although now he has been basically effectively deposed. He's a figurehead. And everywhere that I went, people looked like me. They spoke Tibetan, but they didn't call themselves Tibetan because it's a very politically sensitive area. And there are a lot of spies. And when I was in Lomantang, I, for the first time, felt like I was in Tibet because the architecture is very Tibetan. It's really, really ancient wooden structures and clay, and everything it feels like you're in Tibet. Or what I imagined Tibet to be, anyhow. And I really wanted to go to the border. I couldn't even get into Hong Kong in 2007. And as a Canadian, you don't need a visa to go to Hong Kong. You can just go. And I couldn't get in. I was held at the airport for 5 hours, questioned, and turned around. So I was like, okay, this is my chance to at least stand on the soil for a little while. So, I hired a driver, and, we drove to the border, and it was really scary, I'll be honest. Driving up that plateau was really, really scary. I didn't know what to expect. I knew that there was a Chinese army garrison at the top, and we could only have a few minutes there before they would drive across and start questioning us. And then, who knows? So, but once we began to climb up, and I turned around and I could see how the land literally drops like a cliff, and how dramatic that is. I could imagine what it felt like to do the reverse. And when I stood on the plateau and I could see a new set of mountains arise, and I could see the soil, and I could see how precious this was. I was like, oh, wow, okay. So I didn't know what I was going to do with this. I just wanted to experience it. And I didn't write about it for years. But I had 15 minutes there, and then we had to leave. But I did see, like, actually people had brought remains of their loved ones in the shape of little stupas, which is a Tibetan tradition that you make them into little stupas and leave them. So this was something people had been doing to bring their loved ones back up to the border. And so all of this, you know, I gave to fictional characters into a fictional story, but I was able to use that moment. Now I know the border is very different. It's become even more, the fence is much stronger. You know, it's much more difficult to go there. But I know that, like, that journey is difficult to do. It was difficult for me to do. And there are many Tibetans who cannot do that for a lack of resources, physical difficulty, or, you know, just fear or whatever. So I thought in this book, perhaps I can take people there and let them experience it and bring them back.
I was struck a number of times about how the book is so much about both public and private forms of grief. And especially so in this first part. And I kept thinking how the work of the oracle is, in one sense, the work of bearing someone else's grief. And it seems that, you know, all of the characters, sort of your protagonists, do this in a number of ways. And I was struck too by your introductory remark that you were interested in you know, telling the story or shaping some kind of history with women at the core. And can you talk a bit about the relationship between like grief and womanhood, or Tibetan womanhood in particular in the novel?
I think grief is often very much a communal experience in Tibetan society. Like when somebody passes away, the whole community shows up at their house, and days of prayer. And it's not even like a grief; it's more like duty to help that deceased person and their family, you know, with this process. So we have beautiful rituals for 30-something days, you know, this book really is a book about relationships, and that's why it's structured the way it's structured. It's got daughters is one section, sisters is another section, lovers, and then self. And the self is the only one where it's just one character, but the rest of it is all relational. And I think that people's identities in this book, it's really formed in relation to each other, what we hope and expect of each other, what we do for each other. And so that grief is also carried in these relationships, and the sacrifices we make are for each other, even an imagined future that you will never experience for somebody else down the road. But for women in particular, I think I don't know, I think it's an underexplored area, and I think that, you know, this is just one very specific interpretation from my side. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a tour guide. I'm not here to present the definitive experience of Tibetans. So my interest is in Tibetan women in this book, and the ways in which they quietly hold together a community. And I think Tibetan men have a lot of pressures as well, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. But women, just by nature of how communal we typically can be or have been, it felt like the natural space for this book.
And on the note of quietness, silence appears as a kind of force throughout the novel. Characters listen deeply, for example, until silence is all that there is. There's also the silence that comes with authoritarian acts of violence. So the kinds of like deafening moral silence that I think is very much at the fabric of any kind of authoritarian regime. There's also the silence of prayer, of pilgrimage, and of ceremony. And as I was reading, I thought of a line from Ilya Kaminsky's recent book of poetry, Deaf Republic. And the line is, "What is silence? Something of the sky in us." I just wondered, do you have some kind of theory of silence? How do you see it?
I think silence is very important. And there's a lot of silence in the book because there are a lot of things that I want to leave untouched, where I want the reader to know that there is silence, where there are spaces where they are not given access or don't fully understand. That's also important. You know, I know that this book is coming out in English, right? In a Canadian publication in Canada. It's mediated through an entirely different culture, language, and like world, basically. You know, I'm not talking directly to Tibetans with this book. I cannot. I have to work in this system, in the space I'm in. And it's also the tradition I'm involved in is English literature. So it was important for me to insist that the reader, you know, especially if they're non-Tibetan, can see that there are spaces where they cannot have access, where they are only given a limited access, because I think that that's also sacred. I think that storytelling is a sacred thing. I think the stories that I choose to use, I have to do with like a real understanding of their preciousness and to do that carefully. And there are things that, yeah, I just leave alone, I guess is what I'm saying, because I guess that's another way of like being non-colonial, you know, where you don't get access to everything. And it's clear that you don't.
One of the things that you do tackle, though, is the failure of liberal democracy in Canada to extend justice to and to enable flourishing in the lives of refugees. And there's a stunning passage which you read from actually about a Toronto neighborhood that goes by the name of Little Tibet. And the character, the protagonist, thinks that it might not necessarily be somewhere you land, but somewhere that is a temporary stop. And later, Dolma, the protagonist, reflects, and I quote, "Beyond the welcoming smile of this country lies a vast and impenetrable wall, a national self-regard that insists on a mythic goodness." Immediately, this resonated for me and is a line of inquiry sort of that has been sort of articulated for a while now in Indigenous anti-colonial thinking. But I wondered if the protagonist in the novel does go on to say more, but I wondered if you could, for the sake of this conversation, share why you sort of the place of this kind of critique in the novel.
So the failure of liberal democracy in Canada to really, I guess, live up to its rhetoric, I think is an important topic. And certainly for Tibetans, that's been true. I think in the 90s, the Tibetan cause was trendy, popular. You know, we had the Tibetan freedom concerts, we had a lot of people talking about Tibet, free Tibet stuff everywhere. And then, you know, the West decided that China would be a major trading partner and China would become that, you know, and corporations like Walmart essentially enriched that country for like really earth destroying trade. And also like, yeah, so a lot of this has to do with Western culpability and complicity in ignoring the conditions in their trading partners, you know, country. And China and Canada are major trading partners. And so I'm sort of I was sort of struck by this self-regard in Canada, this mythos in Canada of Canadian goodness. And I think even right now, with this long overdue attention to Indigenous issues and crimes that the Canadian government and we've all benefited from, there's still something that feels incomplete, and I think it extends into other spaces, like with Tibet. Nobody in the Canadian government has said anything about the fact that hundreds of thousands of Tibetan children are now being forced into essentially like residential schools run by the government, in which they are taught that their language, their culture, their people, all of this is barbaric and beneath the Han Chinese culture and identity. And so we can say all the things here, but we're literally doing trade with a government that is repeating our mistakes and actually taking notes from our settler colonial practices here. So for me, a lot of this rings hollow here as a result as well. And I think it has to be really, I think Canadians, we need to really look at ourselves honestly and hold ourselves to a higher regard, like higher standard. And in terms of that wall, I don't know. I sometimes people ask like, oh, where, how do immigrants find a sense of belonging here? And I don't think that's even on offer. I think that wall is very, very present and very real for most people who are not white in this country.
I call it a sound barrier, the sound barrier of historical ignorance, which very much closes in on the lives of Indigenous people. So in your novel, but also in your op-ed in the Globe and Mail in 2021, and as you just noted, you sought to draw connections between Canada's and China's colonial regimes. For example, the shared tactic of colonization through education, which you note being one example of a shared tactic of domination. What sort of value or possibility do you see there being in shoring up a sense of shared struggle between Indigenous peoples here and Tibetans, or even other peoples who are sort of struggling under colonial regimes?
Well, I really think that capitalism, colonialism, class oppression, all of these things are pretty much different faces of the same thing. And I really wish that we could all really just talk openly about these things instead of just being in the sort of space of culture. Like, I really would love for us to all talk about how this has all led us to this moment of like deep crisis in the world. What's happening here, what's beginning to happen here is a long way from happening in Tibet. This, sort of beginning to reckon with or talk about these crimes, that's really, really far away in Tibet. But the work that's happening here can have major effects elsewhere. And so just like, Black civil rights movement has taught us a lot about resistance, I think Indigenous resistance here has taught us a lot, continues to teach us a lot.
So how much time do we have until 6:20? Totally. Cool. I'll just ask one more question. So the Earth is one of the novel's organizing concepts. It's not merely an astronomical object, however, it has both metaphorical and metaphysical importance. And I wonder if you could say more. So it seems to me that the Earth in the novel's worldview is something that is actually produced between people and also between people and the land. And of course, this has everything to do with what colonial violence aims to suppress, just not simply the acquisition of territory, but that's, of course, central, but also the destruction of a certain way of being in the world, such that people, are stripped of their sense of worldliness. And I wondered if you could just say more about the novel's sort of specific vision of Earth and of earthly life that's in contradistinction to the other kinds.
Yeah, the best way for me to enter that would be to talk about the title of the book. So it's We Measure the Earth with Our Bodies. And that's directly in reference to the act of pilgrimage through prostration. So there are many kinds of prostration that Tibetans do, and this is an ancient practice that, in other parts of the world, obviously, in Islamic rituals, in India, and so forth. So in Tibet, people do prostrations in place, like before a holy site. They will prostrate across great distances. They will prostrate around a holy site. And it's a very meaningful series of actions, but essentially it's one in which you lie face down on the ground and measure the earth with your body, literally rise and step to the point where your finger reached. And you move slowly across great distances, and pilgrims will do like months of travel across Tibet. And there is this idea that a lot of the land in Tibet is quite holy, and this goes back to sort of shamanic, like pre-Buddhist beliefs in mountains, rivers, lakes being full of gods and spirits. And this whole land is actually considered to be full of even teachings. The Theravada tradition, which is a treasure text tradition in which texts are said to have been hidden all over the country, all over the land, thousands of years ago, over 1,000 years ago, to give teachings to people to emerge whenever they needed it. And then those teachings are reburied. And so those can be in rocks, inside of lakes. It can be mind termas. And I thought that was a really beautiful way of talking about how important the land is. That it's not just a abstract connection with home, but literally the land is considered to be holy. The land is considered to have something for us that is hidden there for us, that we should have access to. And if we don't have access to, then that is another aspect of colonization that cannot be understood through the conceptual frameworks of nation states or the UN. It's not just about expulsion from the home. It's literally expulsion from an entire cosmology, and expulsion from your gods. And that's incredibly distressing, and that kind of spiritual violence cannot be captured easily by people who don't believe in that or understood by them. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that, for Tibetans inside of Tibet who experience a kind of internal exile in which they're alienated sometimes from their country, and also have very difficult time moving about freely, or even doing pilgrimage like their ancestors used to do. And for Tibetans outside of Tibet who have to, because we cannot return home, we have to move across the world as refugees, as stateless people looking for home. There's a kind of a prayer and a kind of a measurement of the earth with our bodies as well there. So in either case, the pull of that land is still there. And what I wish for the reader to understand, especially if they're not from a Tibetan context, is that when we're talking about decolonization, this is not an abstract idea. This is literally about the land and how important that land is for people, because literally gods reside there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. Now I'll open the sort of audience. If any of you have any questions to Tsering Lama, please, happy to answer. Although the book is for sale at the back, if you're interested. But please, your thoughts, any questions or comments from our discussion.
I'm Roger Bosher from adult education at this university. I feel we're sitting here at a profound moment of history for the university and for Tibetan studies and for Canadian literature. That's Tsering Shakya, the premier Tibet historian in the world. Everybody's got his book, you know, The Dragon in the Snows, on the shelf at home, and any wise graduate student knows to reference that book a few times in the list at the back. And he's written the history of Tibet. Well, now we have this book with a very beautifully designed cover. There's also a history of Tibet, as Professor Shakya said before, but it's written and created in a hugely different and innovative style. The level of creativity and thought and work and research that's gone into this is extraordinary. And the author just told us that she even went to the trouble of going to the border region where these mythical characters allegedly crossed all those years ago, just to check it out and to learn about the subject that she's writing. I've read the book because I bought it a couple of days ago, and I'm still stunned by what I've read. It reminds me of some New Zealand writer friends like Morris Shadbolt, and it also reminds me of Gao Shengjiang's Nobel Prize-winning book, Soul Mountain, 2000. He won the Nobel Prize. This book is written in a very similar and creative style. I'm surprised actually that McClellan and Stewart, they're quite sort of conservative, you know, as Canadian, old-style Canadian publishers, and they're men. There's a kind of a woman's hand in this book. I love this book. I think it's extraordinary, and I think that this is good for the university. It's good for creative writing programs, and what it demonstrates to all those people in Tibet who are so oppressed and colonized by what's been going on there since the 1950s is that it is possible to find a way to tell the story which takes advantage of academic freedom and cannot be subject to the crude forms of censorship and authoritarian control that much Tibetan scholarship is. I'm doing some work on Tibet myself, on filmmaking there, and man, is it hard to get people to talk or even give you a piece of paper. So to go to the border and to make up these mythical characters who go with you and stand there and experience this place, this is an extraordinary contribution to Tibetan studies and to Canadian literature, and I thank you so much.
Brenda, do you have anyone questions from the online? No, yeah. Does anyone have? Yeah, please. Go ahead. Yeah. Oh yes, sorry. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I was a small child when I came from India. I've heard stories from my father, who used to, as an Air Force officer, look after the borders of China and basically, you know, protect the borders. And when I was in India in 1988, I remember going up to the hills up to Shimla and meeting along the mall, which was where the British used to go and have their summer vacations. At that time when I went, it was like a market bazaar with Tibetan women all lined along the wall with their shawls, selling their shawls and rings and whatever they had brought with them, like you said. And I was able to speak with them at the time and to ask them, because they were young, they were as young as I was at that time, and have that access and feel, oh my gosh, I can actually talk to someone. What does it feel like? And they said, we're happy here, but they would they all looked longingly across to the mountain ranges and said, but that's home, you know? And so there was that longing that was palpable. And I'm really looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Good question. Okay, do okay. Yes, Sonamla, please.
Thank you so much. And I remember when your family actually came to Vancouver, maybe I was here like a few years before that. Congratulations. And this, yeah, I came from Tibet to India and then here, so few stops. And then when you were saying your novel, the story ends in 2012, is that right? And that's when I actually first got my Canadian passport after being here for over 10 years and visited my home in Eastern Tibet after 20 years or so. And it's interesting because we go through this journey, and when actually I'm home, a lot of things have changed there so much. So you don't really recognize the home that you left in the sense. But what I'm actually interested in when you started talking earlier, you was talking about how you start to imagine because of being growing up outside of Tibet, you had to sort of connect to the idea of Tibet through the imagination. And how was that? How did you do that? Basically, what are the inspirations? How could you sort of build that process and build that belief in that process? So that's my question. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk.
Yeah, I had to, honestly, this was very difficult for me to do because I didn't feel like I had permission to do that, to even write a scene in Tibet. Felt like, oh, can I do this? But I did as much research as I could. And then I really had to just say, this is from the perspective of a little girl. And this is from the perspective of a child of war, essentially, a child who has already left Tibet and is on the border and is traumatized and is remembering home. And so it's seen through that lens of like something that's been lost. And so it will be colored in a certain way, right? Their memory and their perspective of a home that they've lost will be very different from an adult who's living there right now. So as a writer, I just have to enter into that character's consciousness, and I try to be as real as possible through their lens. But the book is primarily, the book starts at the border. It's never really in Tibet. And I think there are many writers in Tibet who are writing as well of Tibet right now. And so that's why I say that this is just my vision, my sort of idea, my story that I wanted to tell. But I really do hope that the writers in Tibet that are writing, many of them in obscurity, they don't gain attention, they're not translated, they're not published, they're not widely disseminated. I really hope that publishers in the West recognize that there are readers who are interested, and that they can actually do more to bring their cultural power to disseminate these stories from Tibet, from those people's experiences, which is very distinct from my own and this novel's.
Thank you very much. This leaves me. I just first, congratulate Tsering La and thank Tsering La for that. And I just and I need to also thank you for being so gracious and join us. You can get your copies of the book at the back, and we have some momos and some food provided by a Nepali restaurant in Vancouver. So please come and join us for some food. Thank you very much for coming.